All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you all for being here. Welcome to Manchester University College of Pharmacy, Natural and Health Sciences. My name is Ahmed Abdelmajid. I am Assistant Dean of Experiential Education and Community Engagement in the Pharmacy program. I'm also honored to call Scott Alexander a friend, and I'm here to do a quick introduction on a person I'm not afraid to say I have an intellectual crush on. Just intellectual, Scott. So Scott Alexander is a PhD who is currently an Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he is also Director of the school's Catholic Muslim Studies program and Chair of the Department of Intercultural Studies and Ministry. He is co-editor of the Journal of Muslim Philanthropy and Civic Engagement, and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture. He serves on the advisory boards of the Martin Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion at the University of Chicago and the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, as well as on the Academic Council of the Al-Walid Center of Muslim Christian Understanding and the Steering Committee of the Bridge Initiative, both at Georgetown University. He's chair of the Theological Education Committee of the American Academy of Religion and is a regular consultant on Catholic-Muslim relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Catholic Association of the
Diocesan.
It's like, that's one word that I'm going to trip on. Diocesan Ecumenical and Interreligious Officers, and hopefully he'll explain what that means in a moment.
Yeah.
In addition to working on a current book project focusing on triumphalism in Christian-Muslim relations, he is the author of a number of articles in Islamic history, Quranic studies, Christian-Muslim relations, and interreligious dialogue published in scholarly journals, encyclopedia, and edited volumes. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Scott Alexander.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. That translates as, may peace and the mercy and blessings of God be with each and every one of you. There's a favorite hadith or saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that in Arabic reads, Man la yashkur nas la yashkur Allah, which translates really as one who hopes to be, whoever cannot show gratefulness to his or her fellow human beings cannot hope to show gratitude to God. So I want to first thank Ahmed for inviting me here. It's really a privilege to be here to share some of what I do with you folks. And I really want to thank each and every one of you for coming out in a storm that actually has a name. I know it probably doesn't rise to that level. Hopefully, inshallah, God willing, it won't rise to that level here. But my folks live in Boston, and it certainly seems to be sizing up to be worthy of a name when it hits them and leaves them with what's predicted to be 20 inches. So it's Stella. So I actually plan to go out after this and say, Stella! You know, it's the famous. Yeah, I can't wait to do that, actually. Let me just say a few words about where I come from. I teach at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. We're just about going to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And the school is a school that was founded by originally 3 Catholic men's religious orders to educate their seminarians. And it was founded right in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, which was a very important moment in the history of modern Catholicism, thinking about the Church's role in the modern world. And one of the teachings of the Second Vatican Council that was quite extraordinary comes in one of its shortest documents called Nostra Aetate, and it's all about the Church's relationship with people of other faiths, and particularly focuses on our Jewish and Muslim sisters and brothers, and calls for a deeper solidarity and dialogue. between the Catholic Church and people of other faiths, but particularly our Jewish sisters and brothers and our Muslim sisters and brothers. And so when CTU, Catholic Theological Union, opened its doors in 1968, we had a rabbi as a charter member of our faculty. And we just hired our new director of Catholic Jewish Studies, who was an Orthodox Jewish biblical scholar of tremendous talent and abilities by the name of Malka Simkovich. And back in the late 90s, they thought of having a Catholic Muslim Studies program to be a kind of junior sister program to the Catholic Jewish Studies program. And they hired me in 2000, and I've been there for now 16 years. We've been able to do a lot of good things, largely because of the tremendous goodwill and trust of the Muslim community in Chicago and throughout the United States and even different parts of the world. A trust which it's not counterintuitive to me. It might be for some, just deepened after the tragedy of September 11th, and deepens with every challenge we face in terms of realizing the need for mutual understanding and education and building relationships of cooperation and friendship. Not only to strengthen the fabric of our civic society here in the United States, but just to deepen the solidarity of the human family, which is a value that Christians and Jews and Muslims and people of other faiths and all people of goodwill, I think, have. So I bring you greetings from Catholic Theological Union and our attempts in our little corner of the world to make a difference by educating young seminarians and other Catholics and Muslims. We have Muslim students at CTU and Jewish students at CTU who join our MA program in interreligious dialogue to sort of take this work of mutual understanding rooted in a deep conviction of faith into the communities that seem to really be hungry for this kind of work. So anyway, that's just a little word of greetings and a little background about the institution I teach at. This presentation, let me just give you a little background on this presentation. It's new and it's very old. It's new in the sense that I was just working on it, certain aspects of it, a couple of days ago. It's old in the sense that its genesis goes back to when I first took my position in 2000 at Catholic Theological Union. When I first took that position, and especially after the tragedy of September 11th, some different groups would ask me to go to speak, and when I would go to speak to congregations, particularly Catholic congregations, the directors of adult education or whatever would ask me, why don't you come and speak on Jesus in the Quran or something like that, or come and give us an introduction to Islam. And I'd be, oh sure, this sounds great, so I'd go and I'd give this presentation. And then there might be one, when we came to the Q&A, there might be one polite question about something I actually talked about. And then people started asking the questions they came in the room with. I often reflected that if I were going to give a talk on Buddhism, and it weren't to a community that had a lot of, Buddhists in the community or, connections with Buddhist communities, most people that would come in for such a lecture would be coming in with a relative blank slate. They may have seen a little caricature of what they thought was a Buddha in an Asian restaurant, and maybe have heard something about meditation or the Dalai Lama, but other than that, pretty much a blank slate. I quickly realized that no one, especially after September 11th, 2001, that was walking into a presentation on Islam in a Catholic church or in a synagogue or anywhere, was walking in with a blank slate. And so my thought was, why don't I develop a presentation which kind of reflects the questions that, through experience, I've learned people are walking in the room with. And then when we get to the Q&A and discussion, we can have some solid foundation on which to build, instead of me sort of having to give a number of little mini presentations that had nothing to do with the original presentation, I was asked to do. So that's kind of the genesis of this. And basically, I came to understand it as an attempt to move beyond media sound bites. People were interested in trying to understand what they thought they were learning about Islam and Muslims in the domestic and international context by watching CNN or watching Fox News or watching MSNBC or reading some stuff in the newspaper, but largely mass media, largely television media. And I thought, well, my challenge would be, can I come up with 4 or 5 points that I could cover in about 45 minutes, 45, 50 minutes, that would help folks move a little bit beyond the parameters of the media soundbite. So we could really deepen the discussion in ways it's really critical to do, because oftentimes the media is filled with conflicting and contradictory messages that people that are really trying to pay attention and learn something either get confused with or just frustrated with. And then it depends. Some media outlets are definitely, whether they're conscious of it or not, applying lots of negative stereotypes, and negative stereotypes rooted in bigotry and prejudice are not only immoral. We're at an institution here which has as part of its mission statement recognizing the infinite worth of every human being, which I think is just a stunning statement of the importance of recognizing human dignity. But not only is bigotry and prejudice immoral, it's also, pardon me if I use the word, it's stupid. Because it's not based in a real understanding of reality and the complexity of the reality that's there. And so then if we start to orient ourselves in our world, based on our bigotry and prejudices, we're actually doing something that's not quite smart. And we end up doing things that hurt ourselves and hurt other people. So this is just my attempt to maybe share with you. Probably won't get to the 5th point, but like 4 points. This is by no means comprehensive in terms of trying to move beyond media sound bites when it comes to this topic of Islam and Muslims, in the kind of the media imagination, as it were, and I think that was the original title of the talk. I'm sorry if I have the wrong title up here, but in the media imagination, it really I think would take a much longer presentation to sort of, hit on all the major issues. But these are the ones that I thought would probably be significant and that I could handle in the time allotted. So with the idea of 4 points, the first point I just wanted to set the context. All right, so we're in a context of burgeoning Islamophobia. This term is a kind of difficult term, and it gets defined in a number of different ways. But it's come to be the functional equivalent of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism being a particularly pernicious form of bigotry and prejudice that identifies anything to do with Jews and Judaism as somehow deeply flawed and defective. And so it refers to, anti-Jewish hatred and bigotry rising to, not just on the personal level, but rising to systemic levels, particularly as we saw it so horrifically in the middle of the last century. Anti-Semitism is not literally a perfect term, right? Because technically, it means sort of hatred and bigotry of Semites, so it would technically include Arabs who are not Jews. But the technical meaning of the term is not the real meaning of the term, so we understand what it means. And Islamophobia, there's no perfect term for the kind of equivalent deep-seated bias and prejudice against all things Muslim or Islamic that rises to a systemic level as well. But it's the one that has sort of come into the discourse, and it's a good thing, I think, that it has, because whenever you have a problem of that kind, it's helpful to have a term that people use to identify with it. So I have the image of President Trump. This is before he was president, but he made this statement, I think Islam hates us. And I put this here for a particular reason that will actually have to do with the second point I'm going to make very shortly. When we talk about religious traditions, using these tags we have for them, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, we often talk about them as agents. Right? Christianity teaches such and such, right? Islam says such and such. Newsflash. Islam doesn't say anything. Christianity doesn't say anything. They're not agents, right? Muslims say things, Christians say things, Jews say and do things, right? Buddhists say and do things, right? So the notion that Islam hates us, right, is kind of very problematic because Islam, like Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, is an aspirational ideal that exists in the minds of Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, etc., etc. And when we look at Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Christians, etc., we're seeing a vast diversity of folk over vast historical periods, usually, and even contemporaneously, a variety of different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, and on and on and on. So the statement, I think Islam hates us, right? The Islamophobia embedded in this statement, is rooted in a number of things. But one of the things it's rooted in is the fact that Donald Trump is using the word Islam in a way that I can't even parse as someone with a PhD in Islamic studies. If anyone said Christianity loves us or Christianity hates us, I wouldn't know what they meant by that. Right? So, these are just some statistics that kind of compare 2010 with 2015. In the winter spring of 2010, there were just under 10 anti-Muslim hate crimes. In the summer and fall, that went up. These are per month, averages per month, by the way. That went up to about 13, 14. And the reason for that was what happened in that summer, which was the time leading up to the midterm elections of the fall of 2010, in the first term of Barack Obama, was the whole kerfuffle over the mosque at Ground Zero, right? If you remember that, which was neither a mosque nor at Ground Zero. And this was a story, I don't have time to get into the details of it, but if you do the research, it's on one level, it's a very compelling story about Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf and his wife Daisy Khan, who had this vision for an Islamic center near where the tragedy took place that was going to be modeled on the 92nd Street Y, which is a tremendous Jewish cultural center for dialogue and education on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And they even consulted a lot with their Jewish friends, and there was an article in the New York Times actually about how when their friends from the 92nd Street Y were looking at the plans for this center that was going to be down in Lower Manhattan, they said, your stroller room is way too small. Right, so this is what all Manhattanites will understand this, right? That you're not looking at your parking facilities so much in Manhattan, but if you're encouraging young families to come with their children for different events, you have to have a place to put all the strollers, right? And so that's the level at which it went to, and it was quite heartening to read about that. But then come the midterm elections, a number of politicians, this is my read, but I don't think it's that idiosyncratic, wanted to sort of make hay by propping themselves up as the defenders of some nefarious plot to build a mosque at ground zero, which I said was nothing, was neither of those two things. In early fall of 2015, you've got about the same number of anti-Muslim hate crimes per month happening. This is in the United States, by the way. And then in late fall, you see this spike. What happened in late fall of 2015 were the Paris attacks at the Bataclan venue and others. And so you see that incredible spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes. So, you know, we have a problem, obviously, with Islamophobia, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And Southern Poverty Law Center, you know, tracks this, and there are other FBI statistics and stuff that you can look at to track this problem. This is a letter obviously is from a very disturbed person. It reads, "To the children of Satan, you Muslims are a vile and filthy people. Your mothers are WHORES, and your fathers are dogs. You are evil, you worship the devil, but your day of reckoning has arrived. There's a new sheriff in town, President Donald Trump. He's going to cleanse America and make it shine again, and he's going to start with you Muslims. He's going to do to you Muslims what Hitler did to the Jews. You Muslims would be wise to pack your bags and get out of Dodge. This is a great time for patriotic Americans. Long live President Trump, and God bless the USA, Americans for a better way." Now, I have every reason to believe, despite the fact that I'm not personally kind of a great supporter and haven't been personally a great supporter of President Trump, but I have every reason to believe that this letter would make him feel nauseous. Okay, but what I don't know is whether he and some other really good people understand the way in which, to the extent that we allow Islamophobic discourse or anti-Semitic discourse, any kind of hate discourse that rises to systemic levels, to sort of play the role it does in shaping how we think of the world, shaping how we think of one another here in the United States, and even shaping policies, government policies, that this kind of stuff and the people that write this kind of stuff feel validated, right? And these are the people that can do real harm to ourselves, to our children. You know, again, I don't know who wrote this. You know, for all we know, it could be some, you know, liberal agitator that, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you know, that's just writing this. I doubt it, but, you know, could be. But I think it's a symbol of something that we have to be very, very vigilant about. And so that's just my way of trying to briefly set the context for why it's important to try to get beyond the media sound bites, because the media sound bites can be part of the problem. My second point comes from my training as a historian of religion. I teach at a school of theology, but I don't have a theological degree to my name. I have an undergraduate degree in comparative study of religion, and my graduate degrees are in the history of religions with a focus on Islamic studies. And one of the things you learn as a historian of religion, and one of the things you try to teach your students, is kind of goes back to that point I made earlier, that Islam, Christianity, Judaism don't have any agency. They don't do or say anything. It's Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus that do and say things. And this is kind of a corollary, a corollary point. And that is that when we do use those terms, and they're useful terms, you know, I've used them myself. A course entitled Introduction to Islam, right? So I'm claiming that this Islam is something. You know, and it is something, but as I said earlier, what it is primarily is a deeply held aspirational ideal, right, in the hearts and minds of Muslims. That's what it is primarily. But the problem with these terms, and not just Islam, let's take Judaism, for instance. The problem with these terms, a term like Judaism, is its singularity. Because it sounds like you're talking about one thing, right? But you're really not talking about one thing, actually. You're talking about a very, very complex and diverse phenomenon that has a very long history, and that again, even in the contemporary context, exists in a variety of different subcontexts. So in Judaism, for instance, you have at least 5 major expressions, and this is a very clumsy typology, to be sure. 5 major expressions of Jewishness, right? First, let's take the ones that are traditionally associated with religious practice, right? You have Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist. There are others, and in each of those categories, you have so many different subgroups. Or even groups that are emerging between those things, like modern Orthodox, which sometimes is a little between, conservative and Orthodox, etc. You also have, in addition to those 4 expressions that have to do with people that self-identify as practicing Judaism as what we call a religion, you have simply secular Jewish identity. Which, for secular Jews, most Israelis, for instance, are secular Jews, right? They don't practice any particular form of Judaism qua religion, let's say, right? But their Jewish identity is very much informed by what people would call the religion of Judaism, right? And so there are 15 approximately, million Jews in the world. And you've got those 5 major expressions in all the subdivisions, within them, subsets within them. Islam, you got 1.5 billion. Okay? And again, 1,400 years of history. It's not a monolith. It's a faith, like all these other faiths we give these singular tags to, lived out in a variety of different cultural and historical expressions. Some of which certain Muslims deem to be more authentic than others. And that's this dynamic, we can call it sectarianism, whatever you want to call it. But in all of these traditions, right, there are consensuses, right, of what makes you, authentic or not, right? And then when people within these traditions disagree about the nature of that consensus, you can actually have a kind of schism where you actually have some Christians saying to others, you're not really Christian, right? That kind of thing. And the same is true in Islam. So that's the second point that I wanted to make. The third point is related. But instead of trying to get at it from the perspective of the problems with these abstract concepts that we use when we try to understand the complexity of the religious dimension of the human experience, it tries to get at it inductively from just looking at these people who are the actual agents, right, in these traditions, and who have in their hearts and minds the notions of Islam, in this case Islam, as an aspirational ideal. Does anyone know who this woman is? Anyone recognize her? Okay, nothing can make me happier than no hands going up. It's deliberate. You'll see, okay? Her name is Tawakkol Karman, okay, and she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I want to say 2013 or 2014, don't hold me on that. But within the last decade, Ms. Karman received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in the Jasmine Revolution in her native Yemen, which, unfortunately was part of the Arab Spring. And unfortunately, we saw what happened. A lot of the hopes of so many different Muslim leaders, around the world, especially younger people, to have more participation in their society, more inclusivity in their society, were not realized, at least not in the short term. So she received the Nobel Peace Prize for this commitment to peaceful social and political revolution in her native Yemen. So I asked who recognizes. I'm going to ask the flip version of that question when I show this image. Is there anybody here that doesn't know who this is? The exact same response. Exactly the same. Now you might be interested to know that when I use this slide with Muslim audiences, and there are Muslims in this audience, right? But even largely, so if I go to a largely non-Muslim audience, right? They have the same largely the reaction you had. And there are the giggles because I knew it's kind of funny, right? When I show it to largely Muslim audiences, there's the same response. Sometimes there's a few ringers who actually recognize Tawakkul Karman, right? But there are no giggles. There are moans. What are they moaning about? Well, perhaps many things, but it strikes me that, Muslims in the United States are consuming the same mass media that everyone else is consuming. They're receiving in that media the same images of Islam and Muslims that people who are not Muslims are receiving. And they're realizing that even though they recognize the negative stereotypes, they recognize when their religious tradition is being maligned and misrepresented, first and foremost by people like Osama bin Laden, and then secondarily by the people who want to portray someone like Osama bin Laden and not someone like Tawakkul Karman as somehow the true and authentic Muslim, right? They realize that they also recognize the face of the self-identifying Muslim global terrorist, but don't recognize the face of the self-identifying Muslim Nobel Peace Prize winner. So it's a problem, right? It's a problem. This is Muhammad Yunus, another Muslim Nobel Peace Prize winner, in from the early 2000s, for his work founding the Grameen Bank in his native Bangladesh. This was a bank that pioneered, he's an economist, pioneered micro-lending. You give like $250 to a woman in a village in Bangladesh, and she works with textiles or pottery, whatever she does in terms of she can start a business, a small business, and lift her family out of poverty and maybe even her whole village out of poverty and pay back like $25 a year. This was the idea of micro-lending. This is Shireen Ebadi, another Muslim Nobel Peace Prize winner. I think 2006, for her work advocating for women and children's rights in her native Iran. She's a civil rights attorney. This is a picture of the then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey and his wife Emine. This is from a while ago, when I actually used to deeply admire Prime Minister Erdogan. Now I feel slightly different for reasons that I can't get into now. But when I saw this image, I thought that it might it probably was likely to have been taken outside of Turkey on some foreign state visit. Does anyone know why I would jump to that conclusion by just looking at an image? It has to do with what Mrs. Erdogan is wearing. She's wearing a lot of stuff, but I'm talking about her headscarf. So for those of you that might be a little confused at what I'm saying, let me explain. At the time this photo was taken, it was illegal for a Muslim woman to wear a headscarf in a government building or at a state-sponsored event in Turkey. Illegal. And by definition, when you're married to the prime minister, almost everywhere you go is like a state-sponsored event, right? So you've got a 95+% Muslim majority country with a form of secularism modeled on the French version, laïcisme, right, which is keeping religion out of the public square. So much so that if you're a young Turkish woman and you grew up wearing hijab and you try to register for university in Turkey, this has changed now, but you try to register for university in Turkey, you couldn't unless you're willing to take off your headscarf. Turkey is contiguous with the Islamic Republic of Iran, where a woman, by law, cannot leave her house unless she has her head covered. So, what stereotype are we going with here? in terms of Muslim societies and how they're oriented toward traditional religious practice, for instance. Oops. This is Ingrid Mattson. I threw her up here because she's a good friend and dear colleague of mine. She's actually a Catholic convert to Islam many, many years ago when she was in her early 20s. She was president of the Islamic Society of North America for many years, immediately following September 11th, actually. PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago. She now teaches at King's University in Ontario. This is Muhammad al-Baradei. Another Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work heading up the International Atomic Energy Association. He was the guy in Iraq in 2003 telling his bosses at the UN to tell the US administration to cool its jets about any invasion of Iraq, because for the first time Saddam Hussein was giving him access to every single site. And he hadn't yet found the weapons of mass destruction, but he might find it. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to complete his work, but when the Americans got there, they discovered that there actually were no weapons of mass destruction, which I think was his suspicion. This is Ruqayya Ghassara. She is seen here crossing the finish line after having won the 400-meter dash at the 2004 Asian Games in Doha, in Qatar. She's wearing one of the, now Nike has made this kind of official. I forget what it's called. It's called something, and I can't remember what it's called. But she's wearing a great symbol of post-modernity, a hijab with a Nike swoosh on it. I think that's fantastically postmodern, I think. And anyway, you notice her arms are covered down to her wrists, and she runs in long pants. She won. As a competitive athlete, on the world stage, observing her own understanding of standards of modest dress for Muslim women. Now, she doesn't compete anymore. And it's not because she got fat, it's not because she got injured, it's not because she got married and her husband doesn't like her competing or anything like that. And I'm going to tell you the reason why she doesn't compete, and I'm not doing this to embarrass Ruqayya Ghassara. For sure not. Because God knows I'm infinitely worse a sinner than who knows, maybe all of the people on this screen so far that you see. She doesn't compete anymore because she was caught doping. Okay, and so she was banned from the sport. Blood doping, which is a lot of competitive athletes in track and field do this. Okay, why do I share that with you? Right, because it tries to convey the point I hope is coming through here. Muslims are human beings, right? And here we have someone for whom it's important to abide by standards of modesty when it comes to dress, but then when it comes to her behavior in terms of being truthful, not so important, right? That's all of us, at least me. I self-identify as a person of faith, and I can't tell you how many times a day I catch myself doing things that are in direct opposition to who I say that I am as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Hope everyone recognizes who this is, the champ, right? This is Muhammad Ali. And we lost him last year. A great American Muslim. I reflect back on his death and where the country was when Muhammad Ali passed away. And it was amazing. For a couple of days, right after Muhammad Ali passed away, the news, the major networks, everything was celebrating the life of a great Muslim American. So the Islamophobic narrative, right, took a couple of days off, right, because Muhammad Ali had died, and people got a chance to see, what from my perspective, as someone who's been engaged in dialogue with and blessed in so many ways by so many Muslims in my life, is a real Muslim, as most of the people on this slide are. And it was really great. And I remember my Muslim friends telling me how overjoyed they were, especially with their kids, because they were getting to watch CNN talk about a great Muslim for a change. And there are lots there to talk about. It's just that they don't rise to the level of Muhammad Ali. But that only lasted for a couple of days. You know why? Not because the attention of the news cycle is so limited. It could have gone on. But because a few days later, a young man by the name of Omar Mateen, who is deeply troubled about his own sexuality, this is well documented. You can see the interview with one of his male lovers on Telemundo, a Latino man. And Omar Mateen went into the Pulse nightclub on Latino night in Orlando, Florida, and killed at least 50 people. In one of the phone calls to 9/11, he referenced ISIS. And all of a sudden, even though there's no evidence whatsoever that Omar Mateen was in any way materially supported by the Islamic State or in contact with anybody who represented the Islamic State, when we look at his story, he's being raised in a home with a dad who was horrifically homophobic, conflicted about his own sexuality, as his lover says, recently rejected by 2 Puerto Rican men, and then going in as a young male with all kinds of internal stuff going on, out of rage, with guns, and killing people. This, my friends, is a deeply American story. This is not, and if we try to understand a story like this, in terms of, the politics of international terrorism, global terrorism, we're actually missing the story. There's nothing about his story that doesn't track very closely with the story of the Columbine killers, or even to some extent the story of Dylann Roof. And while Dylann Roof walked into a church rooted in white supremacist website, the whole thing, the whole package, right? And killed 9 African Americans while they were praying, right? It was really tough to get newscasters to use the T word more than once or twice. And that event is not an event of a terrorist action, even though occasionally people would say domestic terrorism, right? So it's tragic on all sorts of levels, with the kind of euphoria, not because around this great man's life, Muhammad Ali, and the Islamophobic narrative taking a little rest and then coming back full force, but rooted in very little reality and good analysis. Like all human beings, Muslims have diverse and complex identities which shape them as social actors, right? It's just true. And we can oftentimes miss this. Fourth and final, I see, how am I doing on time? We're doing well. Okay. So, violence, there it is, the big violence issue, right? Yeah. Okay, Alexander, I'm with you up to this point. But why is there so much conflict in the Muslim world then? Why, for example, are Sunnis and Shiites killing each other in Iraq or Syria? Is Islam or are Muslims inherently violent? You probably anticipate that my answer to that question is going to be no, largely because one would hope that one's critical faculties could be aware that the suggestion that 1.5 billion people are inherently anything besides human, right, biologically, is probably, unsubstantiatable at best, and definitely at worst, at the heart of most forms of bigotry, prejudice, and racism. So I wanted to take an example here and just show you this image of young people rioting against police. This is not a picture of Sunnis and Shiites clashing in the streets of Baghdad, as was happening for many years after the US invasion in 2003. It's a scene from Northern Ireland. And it's after the peace accords, after 1999, it's still the unrest continuing. And I remember the first time I used this image, and when it came to Q&A, someone said, Scott, they said, everyone knows, they kind of missed what I said about it, but everyone knows that the conflict in Northern Ireland, even though we say it's Catholics versus Protestants, is not essentially religious, it's actually political. And I said, thank you for making my point again. That's why I put this here. Now, I want to let you know in advance, right? Religion always, if religion is real in a society, if people are really motivated by religious ideas and values, if people self-identify in terms of a faith tradition, there's no sense in which any religion of that kind or religious identity is apolitical. Right? We can't be human beings and be apolitical, right? Even if we decide not to act or not to vote, we're making a political decision. So I'm not suggesting that religion, as one of the many ways in which we conceive of ourselves as complex social actors, doesn't have to do with the conflicts between Sunnis and Shi'is. But what I am trying to suggest is that there's a real problem when we use what are traditionally solely religious identifiers, like Sunni Shi'i or Catholic and Protestant, to identify parties of a conflict, particularly a violent conflict, that has way more to do with what people typically construe as religion. That is, what people read in their scripture, or are hearing in a sermon, or what the basic tenets of the religion are. And it has much more to do with historical context. And it's oftentimes not, as people want to tell you when it comes to historical context, things that happened thousands of years ago. Like, I hope you know that the difficulties, and we'll get into this a little bit, the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland actually, in interesting ways, predates the Reformation, which is the historical starting point of this distinction between Catholics and Protestants. And in some ways, the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, as we see it now in Iraq, still with ISIS and ISIS's anti-Shiite program, and with the conflict in Syria, is far newer, even though these realities of Sunni and Shiite communities have existed for a long, long time. It's just a picture of Bishop Alan Richardson, who at the time this photo was taken, the top photo was taken, was the Anglican primate of Ireland, and Sean Cardinal Brady, who at the time no longer was the Roman Catholic primate of Ireland. And if this were, what I like to say to people is, this is not this does not reveal the prowess of a photographer who got these people who are otherwise hitting each other over the head with their croziers, wanting to strangle each other, to just pause for a moment for a photo op and smile for the cameras. These men have been used the force of their episcopal offices for many, many years to try to counter the violent factionalism that you see represented by the photo above. If it were essentially a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, one wouldn't think that the reality portrayed in the bottom photo would be possible. So what's it about? This is a bit of an anachronistic photo, image, but it gets across the point, right? The roots of the conflict in Northern Ireland go back to colonial invasion and domination, right? When the English, right, invaded Ireland, right? These were not, the Irish spoke Irish, or Gaelic, if you will. The English spoke English. By the way, at this time in the 11th century, they were all Catholic. There was no distinction between Protestant and Catholic. So it was a question of one ethnic group dominating, making an incursion into the region of another, establishing a foothold there. And that's the genesis, right, of this resistance and resentment. And this colonial domination took on many different forms. When it came to the period of the Reformation, you had some nice accelerant to throw on the fire, because now, though the English, who were subjects of the British Crown, were now all of a sudden reforming against Rome, and the Irish in Ireland stayed Catholic, and then the Irish that went with the Reformation, became now members of a different religion, as it were. In those days, you might as well have been, we now call them denominations of Christianity, but in the 11th century, you were talking about the people who belonged to the true church, whom Jesus loved, and the people who were the awful heretics whom Jesus hated, right? So that was the rhetoric that would have been used on both sides. So that explains far more. If you want to know about the conflicts, the troubles in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, it's not going to help you much to study the Reformation and the various problems that the Reformers had with Catholicism, and then the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and that's not going to really. It's going to give you some insight into the piece of this conflict that got kind of ramped up, if you will, or intensified once this religious difference was folded into it. But if that's the only lens through which you're going to try to understand this conflict, you'll never be able to understand it. And if you can't understand it, you certainly can't participate, however remotely, in its transformation. What does this have to do with Iraq? Well, that's where I'm getting. This photo is meant to be a companion photo for the photo of the young men throwing the Molotov cocktails. This is the mosque in Samarra, it's a Shiite mosque in Samarra that was bombed in 2004. Allegedly by Sunni insurgents who were making a statement about how awful these Shiites are, and how we have to sort of fight them in terms of struggling for who is going to be in control of Iraq moving forward after the invasion. This photo is meant to be a companion photo for the photo of the two bishops. This is a photo of an assembly, a majlis, of ulama, of scholars, religious scholars, both Shi'i and Sunni, in Baghdad in that same year, right, coming together to ratify a fatwa, a religious opinion, condemning sectarian violence. Roundly condemning Shiite on Sunni, Sunni on Shi'i violence. Now, I'm sorry to bore you with that fact, because I know that you got tired of hearing about that majlis. CNN would just, if they went to one of the mosques one of the Shiite mosques where Sunnis went for Friday prayers, and one of the Sunni mosques where Shias went for Friday prayers, and interviewing all those people, you were just so sick of it. They did it for like an entire week. No, they didn't, right? Of course not, right? Our friends in the media tell us, if it bleeds, it leads. So everyone heard about the Sunnis bombing the Shiite mosque. And that's on front page of the New York Times, and CNN mentions it. But then, this fatwa, it got page 4 of the New York Times, I think, and CNN mentioned it. But nowhere near as much as the factional violence. So what are people to conclude? Especially, the thing about the Catholics and Protestants, right, is that at least in the United States, you have some Catholics and Protestants, right, who are part of this discourse. And some of them are married to each other, right? And so this notion that Catholics and Protestants are inherently violent, which might be the conclusion an alien would come to, right, a Martian, who was only told that about the actors in this conflict that they represented two different religions. That alien might conclude it's all about religion. right? But almost de facto, people knew, that this wasn't essentially a religious conflict. And again, because many people, the United States is still a largely Protestant country, no one's going to suggest that anyone's inherently bad. But most Americans don't know any Muslims. Most Americans, by most polls, Pew studies, 60% of Americans say they don't know anything about Islam. But almost 50% of Americans have a negative impression of Islam. Get that statistic, right? 60% don't know anything, right? And like 47% have an unfavorable, and that's going up. I like to use the example of leprechauns. If all you know about leprechauns is that they're fighting one another, right? Then you'll be afraid of the first leprechaun you meet. And it isn't until you're introduced to all the various aspects of what it means to be a leprechaun. And even when you know certain leprechauns are fighting each other over something, and you realize it's not about being a leprechaun that makes them fight with each other, right? It's about an issue of what one group of leprechauns maybe did to another group of leprechauns, and how one group of leprechauns is being marginalized by another group of leprechauns, et cetera, et cetera. So another map. If it's not that these are people that are inherently violent, the maps on this slide represent, in a way, moving beyond the media soundbite by going a little bit into historical context. This is a map of the nation-state of Iraq. Does anyone know who drew the borders of the nation-state of Iraq? The British, right. With the permission of the French. What's that about? That's about the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. At the end of World War I, by the way, the Ottoman Empire, which up until the end of World War I, controlled most of Mesopotamia, a lot of North Africa, the Levant, that part of the Middle East where we have Syria today and Jordan and Israel, Palestine, and of course the Ottoman homeland, the Anatolian Peninsula, which is now the Republic of Turkey. Well, they sided with the Germans in World War I, and when they lost, the Allies wanted to take everything from them. The British tried to even take Anatolia away from the Turks, but they fought hard, and they kept the Anatolian heartland, and it became the Turkish Republic. But with the rest of the Ottoman Empire, the French and the British divided it up into the British Mandate and the French Mandate. And the British got this part of Mesopotamia, what's called Iraq. They also got Israel, Palestine. The French got what's today Syria and Lebanon, etc. Now, when the British decided, that colonial occupation, endless colonial occupation was not the way you wanted to go, right? Then you have to move to indirect rule. Right, what the British actually called indirect rule. And that means you set up a nation state, ideally, because that's how Europe is organized, even though the Middle East, the notion of a nation state is not at all indigenous to the Middle East. You set up a nation state, you draw boundaries, right, and then you set up a government there that's friendly to you. And that's what the British did. When they drew these boundaries, they were drawing it around communities, right, that had never had to be part of one nation state. To exaggerate, one morning people woke up and they realized they were Iraqis. Actually, it wasn't one morning, but it took a long time. And they had a flag, right? Okay, because again, this was not an organic process that they were involved in. This was something that was imposed on them. And there were lots of different communities here, but three large groups that are important to know. There were Sunni Kurds in the north. Sunni is a sectarian identifier, right? Sunni Muslims, right? 80%, 85% of Muslims globally identify as Sunnis, right? But Kurds, not Arabs, not Persians, not Turks, they speak Kurdish. That's the ethno-linguistic part of the identity, okay? They're the second largest group of the three groups I'm going to mention. In the south, the largest group, Arab Shiites, okay? So in some ways, they're like the opposite of, not opposite, but they're different on both scores with the Kurdish Sunnis, okay? Shiite, again, a sectarian identifier, about 12, 15% of Muslims worldwide are Shi'i, and Arab, meaning that ethno-linguistically they speak Arabic, they identify as Arabs, okay? In the central part, the smallest group, Arab Sunnis, okay? So they share the Sunnism with the Kurds and the Arabness with the Shiites. Where do the British, when the British sets up the monarchy, yes, Baghdad's in the center and all that, but where do they center it? They center it in that smallest group. And there's a logic there. And the logic there is that if it's the smallest group, they're going to be the most dependent on you, right, for the establishment of their power and rule and control of the country. But then you make nice little deals like, we got your back, right, as long as you have ours. What does you have ours mean? You keep those natural resources that we want so badly for your country flowing to the British through Her Majesty. And we'll be fine. Okay? His Majesty will be fine. And, that was the agreement. And what that does is it sets up this, this understanding that, as long as you're kind of cooperating with the former colonial powers, we're going to have your back in terms of giving you the power and money that you need to establish your control over this country. And basically, however you want to establish that control is up to you. To put this in more modern terms, take a phrase from an essay by Tom Friedman that he published in the New York Times years ago. He said, for so many decades, the U.S. foreign policy has treated the Middle East, and especially the Arab Middle East, like a big, dumb gas station. We drive up our SUVs to the gas pump. And as long as the gas is freely flowing and at a good price, we're willing to ignore the screams going on in the back of the gas station. What are those screams references to? Well, they're references to the totalitarian nature of the regimes that have been set up purposefully to take the economic resources of one country, take their share, and then funnel it outside to an outside power. And even when the monarchy was overthrown by Saddam Hussein, by his Ba'athist socialist movement, he still came from that Sunni Arab minority. As soon as these socialist ideals of reform against monarchy showed the Kurds and the Shiites that they weren't really being given a chance to participate in the political process in any meaningful way, and certainly not to benefit in the economy of this nation state of Iraq, they began to rebel in various ways. And as you know, Saddam Hussein used, every method at his disposal to crush that. What's the point here? Well, I've got the British flag because that's the involvement of the British in this whole story, which we don't hear much about, right, when we're looking at mass media coverage about Sunnis and Shiites killing each other in Iraq. But then the flag of the United States. So the United States invades in 2003 preemptively, right, to prevent, in theory, Saddam Hussein from using weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. And then we shift and we talk about democratization, right? Democratization of the Arab world, beginning with Iraq, etc. Now, most Iraqis, had profound ambivalence about the United States being in Iraq. And by the way, this is something also the media missed. The media often deals in false binaries, either this or that. Ambivalence is, your worst enemy, right, who you never want to see again, is driving out of town for the last time in your brand new Mercedes. Okay, I thought they were going to more about that's ambivalence. In other words, there's something about this that I really like. My worst enemy is leaving for the last time. But there's something about this I really hate. My brand new S-Class, he's taking it with him, right? So, that's the idea, right? So the United States got rid of Saddam Hussein, a tyrant, but now this foreign power is here, occupying us. No one wants to be occupied by a foreign power. But the Shiites saw a silver lining, because all this talk of democracy meant that if there was any reality to setting up a democratic system in Iraq, finally, they're the largest group. By this time, the Kurds were already, they had a no-fly zone for a long time. They had a sort of already functional autonomy, right? So in this struggle that had been going on for so long between the Sunni Arabs in control of the government in the economy and the Shiite Arabs in the south, now all of a sudden the tables are going to be turned. And guess what the Sunnis said? They said, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, praise be to God, God is so great. Thank God the Americans invaded us, because we were starting to lose a lot of sleep about this situation of using all this power against other people. And we just needed someone to shake us out and show us that it's important really to share power with people. Yeah, I'm glad some of you are laughing. And you're laughing hopefully, not because you think you've learned something about how Muslims think, but because you know how human beings think. We have a word for this in Roman Catholic theology. It's called original sin. Okay, so and it's just a fact of life. You've been using your power and privilege to oppress a whole group of people for a long time, and now they're going to get that power and privilege. So the response is yikes, Y-A-K-E-S, right? I don't know how that translates in Arabic, but that's what the response is, right? So, yeah, there you go. So we're in trouble. And again, I don't want to oversimplify, right? There are many, many things that I'm not talking about that are important for understanding the complexity of why Shiites and Sunnis are killing each other, or in conflict, let's say. They're not killing each other. Most Sunnis and Shiites are not killing each other, but why some are. This is what tends to be missing. And again, this is of critical importance. Because if you don't know the history of that leprechaun society, right, you're just going to think that all leprechauns are just inherently violent. So I will stop there with number 4. I think that's probably enough. As I said, I could go to 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, but I don't want to do that to you nice folks. So if we have time, I don't know how much time we have. We
have about 20 minutes.
Great.
Scheduled for 8 o'clock for Q&A. I'm not going to do the running up and down with the mic. He'll repeat the question for everybody. But,
okay.
I'll let you handle the audience.
So just speak up. So comments, questions, pushback, whatever. Yes, ma'am.
The first slide that you had.
Well, you know what? Let me see if I can, so everyone can, because sometimes I'm not good at, is this one going to work? Oh, that one. Let me do it. I'll be happy to do it.
I need my steps.
All right.
The first slide. I don't think it's working. Hello?
Huh.
Sorry, hold on.
Is it?
Hello?
It's just a little low.
Oh, okay. The first slide that you had was from the Southern Poverty. Okay. No, I'm really
Yeah.
The first slide that you had from the Southern
Poverty Law Center.
Yes. The thing that disturbed me about that graphic, and share with me if it bothers you at all, but what came to mind immediately was the murders of the 3 Muslims in Chapel Hill, and how immediately the law enforcement there wanted to downplay that and say it had nothing to do with being a hate crime. And I've read the definition that the FBI has for how they define a hate crime, but the phrase that bothers me is part of the definition says in whole or in part. And that in part makes me feel like that some hate crimes are underreported, because when they say it's a hate crime either in whole or in part, that they can find reasons to say, oh no, that's about a neighborhood parking issue.
Which is supposedly what that was about.
Yeah, versus the guy was, targeting Muslims. So when I see that chart, and it was already bad enough in 2015, in my mind it begs the question, was it actually much worse all of those years because of the FBI definition, and some of those were never identified as hate crimes when perhaps they were?
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. And I think thank you so much for that intervention. I'm sure that's the case. And also, the thing that's up there, those are the FBI statistics, and they're bad enough, right? But what you're saying is, if we're honest, we know that a lot of stuff happens that is not reported, and that's a huge problem. I'll show you another, just in case you're interested, because I have it here. I'm going to show a lot of things that I didn't intend on showing, but it's a slide that might be worth taking a look at since you've raised the issue. Oh boy, this is a lot of fun. I mean, we could have done this, but this is a different kind of. Okay, so this slide is really showing you what it says: homegrown terrorism, right? So you see 2015, right? So deaths at the hands of non-jihadists, just using jihadist as the term, right? Deaths at the hands of non-jihadist extremists by 2015 are just under 50. By jihadists, they're just over 25. So, I mean, have you ever heard some people will say, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. You ever hear that? No, that's a strong Islamophobic canard. It's out there. And you have pundits actually saying this, But, it just shows you, right, how we define terrorist, right? So basically, if you're white and you're doing, I have a friend also who says, if you're Muslim, especially if you're Muslim and male, right, you do not have a right to be mentally disturbed. Right? So, I mean, one of my big fears is, schizophrenia hits young men, oftentimes in their 20s, right? Most schizophrenics are absolutely nonviolent, right? But some are, right? And if you know anything about, schizophrenia, some people in this audience know way more than I do. From what I know about schizophrenia, right? If you're violent schizophrenic, the paranoid dimension of it, internet, thinking you're connected with some larger thing, it's inevitable. It's almost inevitable that a young schizophrenic Muslim, who might be inclined to violence, who's hearing voices, may be hearing, instructions from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's the so-called Khalifa of Daesh, of the Muslim state. But we know what the media will do with that. The minute you mention ISIS, the minute Omar Mateen mentioned ISIS, it became that because his name was Omar Mateen. So people were going to look for that anyway, and how convenient it was that he brought it up. The problem is, it's okay, it's part of the database. He did mention ISIS. We need to investigate that. But what about all this other stuff that seemed to give us the real picture as to why he did what he did?
You touched on the impact of colonialism in the context of Iraq. But, I mean, if we just think for a minute, Saudi Arabia, Aramco, Pakistan, and India partitioning, and all of these. But then overlaid on all of that, it seems the false dichotomy of Shia-Sunni. You have the Arab Brotherhood, you have Wahhabism, you have Deobandis in Pakistan, you have the Salafist perspective on Islam versus a more traditional and moderate Islam. And the traditional schools are dominant, but those other voices seem to right now have undue influence. I'd just like you to comment.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's talk a little bit about that because first, and this is, by the way, this is just the teacher in me who wants to just kind of impress everybody with how cute I can be, and not really a direct response. You use the word moderate. So I just want to cue you all in to the fact, and the Muslims who are here can either ratify this or not, that the term moderate Muslim falls on the ears of most Muslims, like the term non-pedophile priest falls on the ears of most Roman Catholic priests. I guess you all get the point, right? Because what's common to those two terms is the idea that the implication that some majority of this category are all pedophiles. So we have to identify the non-pedophile priests, right? Now, you didn't do that. You were talking about one kind of Islam. But what I want to say about this whole Salafi thing is that I know lots of Salafis, okay? They're some of the nicest people you'll ever want to meet. Okay, and they have a lot in common with some Christians that I know, some Catholics, some evangelicals, some. And one of the things they have in common is part of their theological view of history in the world, okay, works on what I would call a stark dualism between the people who are right and the people who are wrong, between the people who will be saved and go to heaven or paradise and the people who will be damned, okay? The vast majority of those people, okay, would never pick up a pebble to throw at one of those people they think is going to be damned. The thing about the stark cosmic dualisms is that they are easily used by people who do want to pick up stones and who feel religiously motivated to do so, or who think it's a convenient justification for doing so. So that's the piece that I think, and that's an important distinction, right? Because we can't equate, just because some imam gets up and gives a khutbah, and were to say, and I've never heard an imam do this, but you say, all the Christians are going to go to hell and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean that he or his community, are in any way, supporting, violence, against innocent people. And by the way, it also doesn't mean any more for Muslims than it does for evangelical Christians that they don't have an equal stake, an equal right in the ongoing process of negotiating U.S.-American identity. We have this kind of schizophrenia of our own in the United States, right? We have this ideal that U.S. identity is negotiated. We have a federal system, a covenant. There's common good, and people come together in the public squares with their religious values intact. That's what the First Amendment is about, right? And we negotiate. You don't have to leave your religious beliefs, at home when you come to the public square. You bring them, right? And if you're a Baptist and a Catholic, you're going to have different. In the late 19th century, Catholics were very much in the same position Muslims are today with this. That's another whole story. But you bring it into the public square, you debate. At the same time, however, right? And in theory, everyone is equal. We know that's not the actual history of the United States. So we know that another important piece of American identity is that there is an underlying orthodoxy, right? It's basically an orthodoxy rooted in the social construction of whiteness. And in case those of you who have my skin tone think I'm talking about skin tone, I'm not, and I'm not talking about white people being bigots. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how this country was not essentially formed basically based on an ethno-linguistic identity. Yes, English was part of it, but you had different religions and people coming from different backgrounds in Europe. Benjamin Franklin at one point didn't want any Germans to come to the United States, by the way. And so there was a negotiation allowed, but only by those who participated in common whiteness. And if you look at the history of U.S. law, Chinese Exclusion Act, internment of Japanese Americans, legal internment of Japanese Americans, you can see, right, how whiteness trumps the ideal of this negotiated identity, right? So an evangelical Christian can bring some of the most staunchly conservative theological perspectives into the public square. Can go on television, espouse them, can get elected to office, right? Pat Robertson ran for president as a candidate, right? You tell me if you think the Muslim equivalent of Pat Robertson could even give the sermon he would want to give at a mosque.
Or get past TSA.
Sorry. Right. Or get past TSA. So that's a real problem with American democracy. And we have voices telling us that the way you preserve American democracy is to preserve that cultural orthodoxy rooted in whiteness. But that's not going to work, folks. And the people that can tell us the most about this are African American sisters and brothers. Right now, it's interesting, my African American friends look at white progressives like me panicking over Donald Trump. And they say, we've been dealing with Donald Trump for 300 years. And by Donald Trump, I'm not talking about the beloved child of God that is Donald J. Trump. I'm talking about what he represents in the American psyche, right? And, so it's a wake-up call for whom? It's only a wake-up call for those people who finally feel like this has gone too far. But if we're in genuine solidarity with each other and really deeply rooted in our faith values and in our American civic values, we wouldn't be here today. So this divisiveness is all kind of our collective responsibility for ignoring too much for too long. And I hope that this conversation is part of what I know is a process in all your lives, because you wouldn't be here if it wasn't, of kind of resisting the tendency to ignore these things and to work to transform them. Are we out of time, or one more?
Time for one last question, but then Dr. Alexander will be available as well. I just want to end
Yeah.
on time for
And I'm too long-winded. I should give shorter answers. That was my Boston accent, shorter answers to the question. Shorter answers to the question.
Give him coffee before the presentation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Your presentation was
Oh,
excellent.
thank you so much. Thank you.
I am discouraged, as many of us are, over the dumbing down of our society. You know, I hear your talk, and I'm thinking, I wish that your talk could be broadcast on the most conservative news network, because so many Americans need to hear what you have to say. And my question is, how do we clone you? How do we get the message out?
I mean, I really appreciate the love, and I also appreciate the insight. I've done a lot of thinking about it. I don't have an answer. I'm just going to react to what you said. One of the difficult things is that people's fears are as precious to them as what they love. And it's really hard, because when you try to convince somebody that they don't have to be afraid of something they think they should be afraid of, they feel threatened. Yeah. Because there's a lot invested in fear. We invest a lot in fear. We wouldn't have the military budget we have in the United States, right, if we didn't invest a lot in fear. So the question is really, how do you break through that? And I think the answer really is missional on an individual basis. One of the things we're really bad at in this divide we have in this country is talking in a language that the other understands. So, I try to watch it in this presentation, but I broach the whiteness thing, right? But for some people, if they hear that, they're not hearing what I mean. They're thinking I mean that people that come from my background, white European, Christian, are bad. That's not what I mean, right? And when people on the other side of the political spectrum, say some things, my reaction is oftentimes visceral. And I bristle at the notion that I should ask myself what that person is really thinking, or to try to understand what that person really means, because they're using language that really is offensive to me. But where I found success is in engaging people like one-on-one. And all of us come from, I don't know about you, but so most of my extended family, so I'm not and never have been a Donald Trump supporter. In fact, I'm one of those people that stopped watching The Apprentice. I'm not giving myself a pat on the back, but stopped watching The Apprentice when he started to lead the birther movement. And I would like to suggest, by the way, pursuant to my last comment, that if we were really willing to understand the birther movement for what it was, which was perhaps the most overtly racist political movement in post-civil rights United States, right? Then we may have called for NBC and the sponsors to pull from The Apprentice, long before Donald Trump ran for president. And I lament the fact that if Donald Trump had been on tape, forget Access Hollywood, but if Donald Trump had been on tape, and he probably never would, because this is probably not in him, saying the N-word. That's a racist. That's what racism is, saying the N-word. No. The birther movement is far more insidiously racist. And it's insidious because you can have people that, when they do self-examination, can conclude that they're not bigoted or prejudiced personally in any way. But they don't realize what this movement is in terms of American history and what it means to people of color, and particularly African Americans. So I have a family, an extended family, that are all Trump supporters. And, you know, one of the things, I was back there recently, and, you know, a couple of my friends were saying, you know, you think we're bad people, don't you, because you voted for Donald? And I said, absolutely not, because I know you, and I actually happen to know you're better people than I am, at least, right? I'm just telling you, you're really good people. I think you made a big mistake. And I'd just like to have a conversation about whether you think that's right. Maybe it's too early for you to conclude. But if you conclude that it is at any point, what do we do about that? Because I've made mistakes too when I've gone to the ballot box. But what do we do about that? You know? So, I mean, I don't know. It takes a lot to figure out how to resist the kinds of things we want to resist that our faith traditions call us to resist without being part of the problem, more part of the problem. It's really tricky. But we have to take that before us as a real challenge. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you, Dr. Alexander, for wonderful presentation. For the Muslims in the audience, we'll be praying Maghrib in a conference room just across the hall. And for the rest of the audience, I think he can make himself available for a few more minutes if you'd like to ask some more questions. And one of the way that we ask is to share whatever message you might have learned from Dr. Alexander's talk with your friends on your social media. Feel free to tag him. He's a Facebook.
If you want to be friends, I have my cards. Anyone wants a card.
He's not just on Facebook. He's a Facebook connoisseur.
We met on Facebook.
This is the first time we meet in person. Actually, we've developed this relationship. So please share what you've learned. I think it's all a matter of education. It's all a matter of getting people to think of the other perspective. And again, thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Have a good night. One last thing I forgot is that I recorded the talk, and hopefully we'll be